Natalie Johnson is going to give us our opening prayer.
Okay. Good morning, everybody.
Morning.
Morning.
Lord Jesus, thank you for enabling us to gather here today. We wouldn't have done this without you. Lord, help us to be women, people, Tom, who commit to your plans. We go through so many challenges as women, and there are times we want to quit everything. But we know you have created us for a purpose, and by your grace, we can handle everything that you've given us. Help us to commit to your plans and to our relationship with you so that we may not stray from our calling, not just as mothers and wives, but as women who are committed to serving God in different ministries. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. I'm not going to read the resume that Kimberly sent us because I've shared that with all of you, but I just want you to know that she's a member of Abingdon Church and is a very special lady, and we're thrilled that she's able to be with us today. Kimberly, you can share as much as you'd like about your resume and then share your story.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Good morning.
Morning.
So as far as, a resume is a resume. And I think it is one of those moments in your life where you look back and you think, oh my gosh, I can't believe I did all that. And I can't believe I survived a lot of things, because what you see on paper is just a bunch of words. But when you go back and you kind of do your self-reflections, and I'm so blessed, I have to say, to where I am today. Terry's known a little bit about my life. Just when I thought everything settled down, I got cancer 3 years ago now. So I've been recuperating, and we still have a little bit more to take a look at, which, we'll deal with when it comes. But I do have to say that there are pivotal points in your life where you do self-reflections, and I'll kind of walk you through a little bit of it. Abington has become kind of a refuge, if you want to say, for my husband and Taylor and I, and the fact that we kind of let go. And I talk about this with a book that I wrote, which now every time I read this book, I hate it because it's so sad. So I want to go back and one of these days rewrite it and show the happiness and the joy that I reflect on now, going through all of that I went through. And so as far as the resume is concerned, it kind of speaks for itself. I think I'm a little bit more interested in sharing the personal story and personal reflections over the past, I don't know, I'm 52, so I would say 50 years. And I am really blessed with an extraordinary son that I have been fighting labels, and all of us are so caught up in our everyday and labels. And I think we need to start really letting go of that. And I think there's a little miscommunication now. I hope to share that towards the end of what those labels do. And they kind of put us into little boxes. And I feel like, a lot of my fight that I began with Taylor was all about what is inclusion? What is diversity? What is all of this? And I found personally that we seem to be held back by all of these labels. And that was kind of one of the reasons why I wrote the book, was to say, we can let go of that and just be kind and good to each other, no matter what. And no matter what your situation is, no matter if you're in poverty or whatever it is, I think we all need to get to a point in our lives, which I think we all are. Otherwise, we would not be at Abington. We wouldn't be on this call, where we really just need to start coming together. And, I actually was just bringing in the newspaper, and it said, COVID changed churches, and many, this is today's Wall Street Journal, and many aren't going back. And I feel like, again, I'll share, kind of summarize everything towards the end of, I don't ever want to see that, because the most important place is our place of worship and each other. And so hopefully by the end of this, you'll understand where my thoughts are and kind of where I was. And again, bear with me with this fever. It's a little hard to focus. I was born in a small town in Pennsylvania. My father was a amazing builder and architect. Every time we built a house, we would stay in it until he finished it, and then we sold it and moved on. So by the time I was 16 years old, I had moved 23 times between California and Pennsylvania. So I was born in a small town in Pennsylvania, just outside New York, and it's about an hour and 15 minutes from New York and 50 minutes to Philadelphia. So we had a really diverse crowd of people. My parents divorced when I was 13 years old. At 14, I began nannying for a really wealthy family. She was a big model. He was a New York, Boston/New York investment banker. And they kind of, it was just this awkward teenager, long blonde hair in the countryside of Pennsylvania. And all I knew were cornfields and the fact that New York City was an hour, 15 minutes away. So my mom would take me into the city every once in a while. And we had a lot of culture, even though we were out in kind of farm country of Pennsylvania. And I think that's why I gravitated to Virginia. It's very, very similar, just with water. But I began nannying for this wealthy family and later lived with during college. So they really took me under their wing. My parents were a bit of a mess. I think that was back in the day where discipline was a little bit different. We treated a lot of things a lot differently. And what we now reflect back on and say, oh, that probably was not appropriate for kids and discipline. Thankfully, we have moved beyond those times, but I definitely struggled throughout my teenage years. I was sent away to a boarding school just outside. It's called the Tri-State. So it was called Oak Hill Academy, Virginia. So it was almost into North Carolina, Tennessee, and Virginia. And my stepmother said, oh my gosh, it's a lot of kids just like you. They love to have fun and party. You're going to love this school. Well, dear God, I think it was kind of like a little reform school, even though it was a prep school. So you're not allowed to talk to anybody for 3 months. And, the story goes on and on. I ended up staying there throughout my senior year. And I still have really good friends from that experience. And, like I said, with each struggle in your life, you have to look at it as a positive, because otherwise you're always stuck in this little victimhood that I never understood. You might be down, but you can always get back up again. So when it came time for me to go to college, my dad thought I was crazy. And he's like, hey, we've done enough. You're on your own. And even though those were tough words, I was definitely a late bloomer. And it was probably the best thing that they could have done for me was not give me everything. I needed to struggle. I needed to suffer. And I think that's what made me who I am today, that I'm very proud of. And if anybody looks back over, I had a good friend of mine ask me this a few years ago, and he said, would you change anything in your life? Any of my decisions, good, bad, whatever they were, horrible decisions? I said no, because this has brought me to where I am today and who I am today. So I moved I was accepted to a college in Florida, and the wealthy family took me in. So I've literally been working for them since I was 13, 14 years old, intermittently, but now they help Taylor go through college. They help me go through my master's program and all my other schooling. So they truly were a blessing in disguise from when I was a little girl. And they showed me structure. They showed me what a family unit was, even though theirs was different as well. They were both he was on his second marriage, so she inherited his kids. And they were very difficult times, but I became that steady Eddie in the family, even though I wasn't a part of the family, that everybody picks up the phone and calls me if there's ever an issue. And they know that I will be on the next flight if I need to. So through them, I was introduced to I went to the College Boca Raton back then, which is now Lynn University. I was 19 at the time when I moved down there, and I'd never seen wealth like this before, ever. And they lived next to John Lennon's house, and when I say Palm Beach proper, it literally was Palm Beach proper. So you have the island of Palm Beach, and then you drive over to West Palm, and that's where the businesses and a lot of great restaurants and stuff has changed over the years were. And so they gave me a place to stay in the house. It was like a 13,000 square foot house. So it's not like it was a hardship for anybody. I couldn't afford a car, so I bought a scooter. And if anybody has ever driven through the rain of South Florida, it was like you're stuck in a washing machine on the rinse cycle and you're never getting out. So I would have all my books in my backpack, and then I had my drawings because I went to school for interior architecture. I had that strapped to my back, and lo and behold, years later, now that I look back on that experience, was I learned to race motorcycles. So I went on to be a semi-professional motorcycle racer while I was going through college. My home track was Homestead, Florida, West Palm Beach, and then Daytona. So I was famous for being this little tiny blonde on this ginormous motorcycle. And yes, it was just a phase. I don't do it anymore. I sold my last motorcycle about a month or two after Taylor was born. And I thought, well, I can't get away with this anymore. I got to grow up. So I was introduced to some really incredible people. I started by putting myself through college by stewardessing on mega yachts. So my first boat was 175 feet. I saw a little advertisement in the newspaper, and I had no idea what it was. I didn't know what a stewardess was, but I figured I can do anything. I'm broke. I got to get through school. And so I joined, and my gosh, I joined it in San Diego, and I was gone for 6 months. So intervally, I would stay on the yachts until it was time to go back to college. If I didn't have enough money, then I went back and, kept stewardessing. So I went from San Diego all the way up into Glacier Bay, Alaska, and all points in between. So when I say 6 months, you had your clients come on board, or the owners of the boat come on board. And thankfully, they never really liked high seas. And so the owner would only come in for 2 to 4 foot seas. And when I say I was seasick, I am seasick, I'm motion sick, I'm airplane sick, you name it, I get sick with any kind of motion. And so for the long hauls, everybody would just kind of carry me. I would be in my bunk. We would never have clients on board. And I worked so hard that the captain and the head stewardess just said, it's okay, she's going to be sick for 5 days, feed her some saltines and whatever, some chicken noodle soup, she'll be good to go. And sure enough, the minute that boat was back at dock, I was up cleaning and ready to go. And so the funnier story was, like I said, I had never been around people like this before. I was really blessed with 2 owners. They were very, very Christian. They were the sweetest people. It was a dry boat. And wherever they needed me, they would actually fly me in between college semesters. So I worked for them for about 3 years. And I was, like I said, I was very, very blessed with them. We did up and down the West Coast and then East Coast, and they would charter it out. If the owners weren't on board, they would do something, what we know it now as chartering the boat. So it was $100,000 a week plus, alcohol and crew and all of those expenses. And it was a fascinating life. But when I say you worked, I mean, I would be on, sometimes we had Time Warner, and the gentleman was actually dying. His name was Stephen Ross, and his wife was the heiress to the Coca-Cola fortune. And I'll never forget, I was walking back to the galley, and I heard this voice, and I'm like, God, that sounds so familiar. I was asking where the head was. Well, the head on a boat is, the bathroom. I was like, God, that's so weird. It sounds like Chevy Chase. And sure enough, I turned the corner, and there was Chevy Chase. So it was just one of those things where I thought this was normal. I thought everybody got jobs like this in between college. We went all through the Caribbean. We went all the way up into Nova Scotia, and all points, like I said, in between. So it was really fascinating. My paychecks were clipped together with a staple, and they were all $100 bills. So you worked hard. I would get up at 5:30 in the morning, and I would be on deck until sometimes midnight. We weren't allowed to sit until all your guests or, relax or anything. You were always standing at attention in the main salon area or wherever you were on top deck or aft deck, you were always on call, and you were always meant to kind of just be a ghost and think before somebody wants something, you're supposed to anticipate their needs. So I have a million cute little stories on this one, but I was on the aft deck, and when I say aft deck, I mean, this thing is 5 stories tall, and it's got a 30-foot boat that was our tender. And not to be construed that I was by any means one of the guests. I was definitely one of the worker bees. It was heads and beds. And like I said, you worked really hard. But I was on the aft deck. And like I said, you were trained to figure out when somebody's drink was finished. You would automatically just swap it out. So I walked up to Clint Eastwood, who's sitting there with, what's his name? Now I'm not going to remember. Oh my gosh. Who's the huge Kate Capshaw's his wife? Oh my gosh, just blacked out. There's the fever, right? When you can't remember somebody's name. I'll remember it in a minute, but he was married to Steven Spielberg. So he's sitting on the back deck, Kate Capshaw, Steven Spielberg, and Clint Eastwood. And Mr. Eastwood looks at me and he goes, "You touch my beer, I'll break your arm." I'm like, God, I love this job. It doesn't get any better. I'm only 21 years old. This is awesome. And they, just really, you see these people in Hollywood or on television, and yeah, a couple of them weren't very nice, but for the most part, they were really, really cool people, and they had their own struggles in life. And, I think they appreciated us because they saw how hard we were working every single day. And now this is kind of commonplace in society for that upper echelon of people. But for us, it was just kind of the beginning. And so I did that for several years, like I said. And then my senior year, it took me 5 years to get through school. My senior year, I met a gentleman named Henry Mellon. And the captain, I didn't, sight unseen, I only had a few more months, one more semester to go. And so I accepted the job over the phone, met with the captain. He said, it's a sport fishing boat. And then you have to remember, I don't have no idea what a sport fishing boat is. Remember how sick I get from movement. So I got down there, and I didn't know why everybody was making such a big deal. He was only 5 years older than me, but so it was his grandfather that started Mellon, great-grandfather that started Mellon Bank. So he was the direct heir. And I could not have entered into a better family than these people. They were just extraordinary. They kind of, same thing, took me in under their wing and brought me, above where I could ever possibly be as far as an interior design company. So I started my company in 1995, which was my senior year. I was working on the boat part-time. I ended up managing Henry's house. And if it was anything, I became his executive assistant. And so if anybody needed charters on the flights, if they needed me to go to Europe ahead of time and set up the house and set up everything, I was the go-to person that did absolutely all of it. And again, remember, I'm the worker bee. There is no personal anything as far as being on the other side. And looking back again, I would much rather be on the back end of things than being a guest, because I think it just is more intimate when you're living with 12 people and crew from all over the world. You really get to know people on a different dynamic level. So it was pretty cool. But Henry and his family took me in. They were fantastic. He had lived, now I have to go back a little bit. He had lived in Maine for several years, and they had called them the cottages. So it was Vanderbilt, Carnegie, all of those guys. And he grew up with Elizabeth, and it's the sweetest love story. Henry and Elizabeth knew each other when they were little kids living next to their, in their grandparents' homes. And I'll never forget the day he looked at me and he said, "I don't know how I'm going to make this happen, but I have to marry this girl. She's just everything I always hoped." And they went on to have 3 kids and very happily married. And it was a neat story. But they really helped me in my first place. The family helped me get through that last semester of college. And they helped me start my company. So the first boat I ever designed was 100 feet, which is a big deal for somebody that's only 24 years old. And again, at the time, I didn't know I wish reflecting back, I wish I knew more. And we all do when we look back on life. And like, gosh, if I'd known now what, then it would have been a lot of things would have been a lot easier. So I started that company at age 23, 24. I was still racing motorcycles. 9/11 happened, and it literally cleaned out everybody that was in private aviation interiors, yacht interiors. And then if I took time off, I used to joke I would take on a residential project, and everything just kind of collapsed. And I just said, I was dating somebody at the time that had started online banking. So he was retired. Good grief. I think he was 30 years old or 32 years old at the time. So I was around a lot of really wealthy people, but I felt like, even going to some of the charities, the black tie charities and all these things, we would always get free tickets. Nobody ever talked about the cause. And I always thought that was so strange. There's all these people and they're cocktailing away and talking about themselves and their stories, but they weren't talking about why we were there in the first place, which was AIDS or the Young Friends of the Red Cross. And I got to know a lot of really interesting people, but more on the worker side rather than the participant side, the people that were paying the $1,000 a plate or $5,000 a plate. So I was always kind of conflicted with this. And I thought, gosh, this is so strange. Why don't they ever really talk about what's important and why we're there in the first place? So fast forward, 9/11, I moved to California. My dad had a house in Lake Tahoe. He knew I was a little heartbroken from this relationship that didn't work out. So I kind of let the company stand. I packed up my dog and sold my house in Florida. And I just didn't see it coming back as far as yacht interiors were concerned. And I said, if it does come back, it's going to be about 10 to 15 years, which is where we're at now. And 300 and 400 foot yachts are going to be on wait lists, which they are. So your dynamics have changed so rapidly from, what I knew then to where we're at now. I took a year off, did everything, hiking, biking, skiing, everything I always wanted to do. I was always a super athlete, and I don't know, I just found my home in Lake Tahoe and got to do everything I ever wanted to do. And then, like any kid, you run out of money, it's time to get back to work. So a year later, I went to work for a woman named Beverly Bone. And she was one of the most lovely, intelligent women I've ever met. She and her husband built and raised their kids in the house that's now known as Michael Jackson's former home. So she and her husband built that. She had this beautiful lakefront home in Lake Tahoe, and I lived above the garage as her executive assistant. I took the job knowing that she had terminal cancer, and I don't know, she was just such a dynamic person. No matter how sick she was, I would medevac her down to MD Anderson and wherever we were, we just always made the best out of everything, no matter how sick she was, or the different treatments at Stanford University and all of it. She just always had the most amazing attitude and positive. And no matter, like I said, how sick she was, she just kept moving forward. Beverly ended up living for about 4 years. They gave her 6 months to live, and she lived about 6 years past those few months that she was supposed to live. And extraordinary human being. I think she taught me as a female how strong, how intelligent, and unashamed of intelligence that you should be, which was neat for me. I always struggled with dyslexia, very severe dyslexia. So I just learned to move around it as far as school is concerned and whatnot. And my creative artistic side always kind of kicked in. So it morphed into other positive things rather than just being 100% book smart. So that was the one thing I can walk away from with Beverly. She was really extraordinary. At the time, I was working for a little over a year. I met my first husband, and it was one of those California stories where he's tall and handsome and now not so smart that I figured it out, but he and I were together very fast. It was one of those, you always hear these stories, California stories, where we met, we were engaged, pregnant, could have put in a different order and then married. And it was a struggle from the very beginning. I never should have married him, but I felt like I was doing the right thing. I felt like it was time to settle down. I was 30 years old and I'd had an extraordinary life. I'd been all over the world, and our little time clock was ticking. So that's where we ended up. And from that point on, I have to say, Taylor came into my life at an extraordinary time. And I talked about it in the book. It took me 9 years to write this silly little book. But it was one of those moments in your life when he was born, everything changed. And everybody can say that, about their child or their grandchild or whomever this is that comes into your life. But I really, truly believed, looking back, that Taylor definitely saved my life in a lot of different ways. And so the book is called Fighting for Taylor, A Mother and Child's Journey of Inclusion. And this was Taylor on one of our favorite walks. I used to actually do this walk when I was pregnant to get away from my ex. And like I said, his drinking was not as apparent, although it was looking back in the very beginning. The more the pregnancy went on, the more domestic violence had occurred. And so it was a tough, believe it or not, it was probably only 2 or 3 years that I went through this with Taylor. And I'm going to read just a few different points because I think it's important to go through different conversations and stories about where you were in life and why you are the way you are today. The road to Vermont has been an arduous one. This is after I left. I got tired, and I'll talk about this in a little bit. I got really tired of struggling for fighting for Taylor's education, fighting for him to be included in a general education classroom, fighting for food. I mean, I went from making $375,000 a year in my mid-20s to welfare. And I realized I was, when you're so broke that I was driving to work one morning and I realized that in my bank account or in my wallet, I didn't even have enough money to buy a bar of soap. And I was like, okay, now this is broke. Like, this is not what I was thinking my life was going to be. Taylor was born September 30th, 2004. And there were a lot of things leading up to me knowing that something was different with Taylor, but I couldn't really necessarily pinpoint it. But again, I'm just going to read a few different passages out of the book because I think it'll be a little more informative. The road to Vermont has been an arduous one, no doubt, from wealth to welfare, from despair to triumph, and from selflessness to compassion. I have lived life's everyday challenges with hope and resilience, holding on to my dream for a better tomorrow. As I sit and relish the solitude of our front porch, my gratitude is greater than ever for my life my son has taught me to embrace. And for the first time, I have found peace as a parent and actually know its true meaning from deep within. What a remarkable country the United States of America is, and how blessed I am to live in a country where you can change the course of your life just by having a thought, a dream, and the ability to work hard. It's been 8 years of putting my pen to paper and telling the most intimate, personal parts of my son and I's life in the hopes of making a difference, even if to help only one person. This book is not just a personal account of a mother and child's journey. It's a call to action for all individuals who share concern for education and social welfare, as well as parents who worry for their children's future and their own. And it all begins at home. From my home to yours, I hope to instill thoughts and ideas about making tomorrow a better place for everyone, most of all for our kids. My son may be a little different, and I may not be perfect, but we are the family next door. You have to remember, I signed off on, I was so terrified of my ex and that he would ever harm my son. And so Taylor came home from the NICU unit. We were not home for more than 8 days. And my ex had, he went to a local Oktoberfest and he came home and he just lost it. I don't think he could ever understand not having a perfect child or not not understanding what Down syndrome is. And so we were home from the NICU and he just lost it. And it was kind of the last episode of him drinking too much. And I will read a little bit about that because it was one of those moments in your life where it changed me forever, and I will forever protect my son. And what was I going to say? Whether anyone wants to talk about those that are not the norm within our society, because for whatever reason or cause, parents like me and children like my son are the new norm. And so I kind of go into all of these numbers and not heavy, but just little bleeps. You know, when I started this whole process with Taylor when he was born with Down syndrome, primary diagnosis. When he was 9 years old, he was identified as autistic. And so when I started this, it was 1 in 88 children. Now it's 1 in 166. Now the numbers, they're coming out and saying probably 1 in 55, more prevalent in boys have autism. So it was kind of just the beginning of my journey. So I will read just a little bit. Like I said, if this gets boring, Terry, or you feel like I need to speed up, just let me know. So chapter 1, adversity. As I lay on the bleach faded sheets of my hospital bed, a nurse helped to put a surgical cap over my head, gently tucking my long blonde hair under the elastic band. She spoke with calm and ease, assuring me everything was going to be okay. Step by step, she began to explain the events that were about to follow. My baby was in trouble and they needed to perform an emergency C-section. He wasn't getting enough oxygen and his heart rate was dropping drastically. The memories of the night before kept coming back to me. I could feel him kicking within and then nothing for several seconds, then a kick, then nothing. My husband and I were having what I thought would be a nice quiet dinner in anticipation of our son. As my husband poured glass after glass of wine before dinner, I asked him to hold back in case I went into labor and he needed to drive me to the hospital. The day before, my doctor had tried to induce labor, given that the baby was overdue. As the evening wore on, I had a mother's instinct that Taylor was ready. Our feelings of anxiety and trepidation were adding to the tension and unease between us, meaning my husband. I kept reliving the events of the past 11 months, and in spite of them, I was still trying to build my imaginary white picket fence and find normalcy in our relationship. My strength and courage would bring me through everything. I thought it was my duty as a wife, after all, and the duty of a mother-to-be. It was my job, my calling, to fix everything that was wrong with our relatively new marriage. But another part of me also knew that pride simply wouldn't let show me the outside world our dysfunction. I knew I had made a mistake in marrying him. And so it really was a constant struggle of him kicking me out of the house. And, you know, as in this dysfunctional relationship, in any dysfunctional relationship, you have to be the person that stands up and says, I don't want this anymore. And it became even more apparent when Taylor came home. And I was now the sole caregiver, obviously, because my husband was not able to at all take care of him. So when Taylor was born, and we realized that this was definitely not going to be a successful marriage, I signed off on child support, which then put me into the extreme welfare program. I stayed home with Taylor for 2.5 years. I don't know how I did it as far as finances were concerned, but I just kept pushing and pulling from every resource I probably could imagine. And it was definitely not a fun time, but I don't know, man, when that baby was on my chest and the nurse and everybody just looked at me like, oh my gosh, you know, they knew instantly that Taylor was different. And I didn't care. I just thought this is the greatest moment in my entire life. And I remember talking to him, and there was one excerpt I just wanted to read real quick. I probably won't find it now. I'm sorry. I wish I was feeling better. Rather than battle, this is one of the last modes of our relationship. Just as many nights before, he continued to drink as I slept. In his usual pattern, he would wake me up from a dead sleep to ask me a question in his aggravated and oddly aggressive voice. Rather than battle, I picked up a pillow, headed to the linen closet for a warm blanket, and regressed back downstairs to sleep on the sofa. This was the night that Taylor was born. It was just easier to ignore him than find a safe hole to crawl in. He went on to actually be charged with 3 counts. I won't go into it too much. I can send you a book if you'd like, but he was charged on 3 counts of domestic violence against by the DA. And so we had moved from Lake Tahoe down to Marin County, and thank God, because Taylor was medevaced into UCSF in San Francisco immediately, just was not breathing. They could tell he was jaundiced. The umbilical cord was short and wrapped. I mean, he had all kinds of issues. And so as my husband is sitting on the edge of the bed crying, I'm like, what are you crying for? There's this beautiful baby. I mean, he might have some problems, but, I just kept saying to Taylor, whatever it is, I talked under my breath as they put him on my chest, and I said, it's you and me. Like, whatever it is, whatever's going on with you, we're going to figure it out. We're going to figure it out together, and it's going to be okay. And from that moment on, I just was resilient. And when my ex had his final blow up, the police were called, and the police just looked at me and they said, this will never change. He will never change. And sure enough, to this day, I made all the right decisions, even though it was very difficult. So most of the rest of our story was us really going through all of these, difficult times of me taking whatever job I possibly could. I ended up back in the design world, which was amazing. I worked for this incredible company called Dongia. So I was able to go do outside sales with all my textiles and wallpapers and Venetian glass and all this great stuff. Taylor was 2.5 years old. So I'm fighting the schools. I'm fighting for him to walk. I was fighting for him to talk, and OT, PT, speech. I mean, the list goes on. And each one of these places, you have to remember, you're going to a different office. You're going to a different, we were always at the doctors. We were always at the hospital. And that, like I said, was 2.5 years. I was able to put him into the Head Start program when he was 3. And once I started to get on these government programs, I realized how broken the system was. I realized how broken the educational system was, and having to just constantly fight. And the interesting thing, looking back on this too, is that I had a lump in my left breast in 2006. I was always on Medicaid. I was, in between different jobs. However, I was getting promoted. I just never stopped working. I would take Taylor down to my mother's house. We used to call Southwest Airlines the taxi cab because it was like $50 per each way. And through working for this design company, I was back and forth to Europe and all over the United States. And it was a really tough time. But I always made it work. And I think the only regret and wish that I had, and we all do when our kids were young, was I wish I could have enjoyed those moments more, because I was always struggling and fighting and working. So that was kind of what I look back on now as the beginning of cancer, knowing that, every 6 months or every year, the doctors would just say, oh, it's a different category of payout when it comes to insurance, as we all know. So they never did a biopsy. They never did anything, which led me to a double mastectomy 3 years ago. So I always say, watch what you ask for when you're asking for healthcare to be changed. We need to find a different system so that people like my son and myself are not lost. I ended up, like I said, struggling. And I just said, there has to be something better than this. I mean, I can't keep fighting all this. I was exhausted. So I wrote this book, and I submitted it to this. I was trying to find an inclusive environment. What is the best inclusive environment that my son can get as an education, and as a whole? So not education, and not just education, but spiritually, a place that everybody went to church on Sunday. It was just a really simple life. So I looked at Massachusetts, I looked at New Hampshire, I looked at all of the major schools that had inclusive practices were mostly in New England. And now I know why, because it's so cold. There's nothing else to do but study in the wintertime. So I ended up getting an out-of-state scholarship for my master's degree in early childhood special education, because I thought, I'm going to make a difference. I'm going to be the change that I want to see in life and on this crazy program. So I submitted it. I was accepted. I sold everything that we had, including some of Taylor's toys, my ski, anything I could rustle money up for. Sold our little condo, and you have to remember I was like 8 minutes to the Golden Gate Bridge. So now that I look back and selling that for, I think I sold it for $130,000, which is a lot of money back then. It's now $575 for 800 square feet. So darn it, I missed that lottery. I should have held on to it. But you're always trying to, you have to sell to be able to get enough money to move on to the next place. So one of the best things I ever did was that. And UVM, the University of Vermont, was extraordinary. I ended up working for the Dean of Education, anything I could to keep us going. I was selling textiles to anything as a side job to several. I represented 4 different Italian mills. And I was basically selling what we call air. So I was able to at least work from home, which we all now knew very well. But I was able to work from home, support Taylor and I, and go through this master's program. Along the way, at 9 years old, like I said, Taylor was diagnosed with autism. And several of the therapists said he really needs a heavier, inclusive, one-to-one environment, which we all know now is private schools, and they're extremely expensive. And so I finished my degree and realized that I would love to do early intervention, which was birth to 3, and you work with teams, pulling in all the resources for each one of the kids and identifying what their disability is and how you can help them and coordinate teams. So I really thought that's what I was going to do. This is great. I can work on a school schedule. Then I realized what the paychecks were, and you were talking probably $25,000, $30,000 a year in Vermont, for whatever reason, is extremely expensive. And I said, well, okay, this isn't going to work. I can't afford to support both of us on this. So I found out about a school in Houston, Texas, and it was called the Arbor School, and it was a one-to-one program. Absolutely fit every bill possible for Taylor. And so here we go again. I packed up everything, and we moved down to Houston, Texas. I'd never been there before, just the same. I'd never been to Burlington, Vermont for UVM. I got our place over Craigslist in both situations. And I was just determined we were going to make this happen, and I was going to figure out how to help Taylor. So we spent 2 years in Houston. I got lucky again, worked for the CEO of a large oil company, which was a whole other world. I know Terry can attest to Texas. It's a very, very different place, especially from San Francisco to Vermont to Houston. It was really different. But I was really blessed by all of the people that I met, and I worked extremely hard. Did one kayak trip that I'm still recovering from. It was 40 miles from New Orleans. This was to get Taylor another, year of tuition. So I had all these great people sponsoring me, but I did a 19-foot kayak, solo kayak, from New Orleans down to the Gulf of Mexico, which is where all the refineries and everything are. And it was 40 miles, and I left at 7:10 in the morning. I'll never forget it, because I looked around, and it was a really cool situation, but I looked around and I'm like, oh dear God, what did I do to myself? It was all these shrimp boats taking off at the same time. And my boss was very well connected because of the oil company. So he said, Cam, you can't go down there all by yourself. He was a heavy Alabama accent. So he hooked it up that I had a 20-foot U.S. Coast Guard couple of guys that followed me all the way down. Somebody else gave me a Joe boat. I don't know if you know what that is, but I was able to make the trip down, and they followed me in case there was an emergency. But I realized I was in trouble once I got to the ocean waters. It was not easy by any means. And I was in the clear. Everything was great. Anytime a shrimp boat or somebody would take off, the Coast Guard would shine, flick their lights, and it was seamless until I get I'm almost to the dock. I see the dock, and it was, by this time I had left at 7:10. It was 4:30 in the afternoon, constant paddling. The only time I stopped, there was no bathroom stops or anything, was to eat these little shock blocks. It's like a sugar thing. I don't know what they are. And a Cliff Bar, banana, and some water. And so I'm almost down there, and all of a sudden in the Coast Guard, everybody's so excited. And the next thing I know, these women, they must have been drinking. I have no idea what they were thinking, but they were in a fishing boat, a fairly large fishing boat, like 40 feet, and they gunned it. Well, when they did, I got sucked up into this wave, and it did a 360 and snapped my neck. And it was one of those where I've had this happen before. They call it stingers, where I had a stinger. I went overboard and hit my right shoulder when I was skiing one time. I was out of bounds. We shouldn't have been doing what we were doing in the first place. And it stings to the point, and then it goes numb. So you think, oh, it's broken. So I thought I broke my neck, and I came to, and I just kind of kept moving my head, and I turned, it was fine. It was no big deal, but it was like, are you kidding me? I'm almost there. I see the dock. What were these girls thinking? Well, let me tell you something. Those Coast Guards, they had a thing to say to those women. They got a huge fine. I was almost there. So as far as Houston, it was a fantastic place. It had its moment in time. I was dating somebody. It was actually a captain, and this is prior to my lovely husband now. It was a captain in the Navy, and he was a pilot as well. They call him a backseater. My husband calls them Wizzos. I don't really know what that means, but it's a backseat guy, and very sweet, very nice. And I really thought this was it. I'm finally, after all these years, going to be in a long-term relationship. And he decided once I got to Virginia, this is too much responsibility and whatever. So thankfully we parted ways, but I ended up in Virginia with Taylor. And I had found, in the meantime, the Peninsula School for Autism in Newport News. And this is before it became Phase-On, and it was fantastic. It was really everything Taylor needed. But with each one of these schools was, it started off at $25,000 for the Arbor School in Houston. Then he had to move into a more self-contained classroom, so it was $30,000. Then we got to the Peninsula School for Autism, and I think the last count was $75,000 a year for the school, which is absolutely ridiculous. And we're, it's fighting through the school boards and fighting to make sure he has a one-to-one aide because he's still nonverbal and whatever. So again, the fight will always continue. I'm pretty sure some people were meant to keep fighting, and hopefully that makes a difference for other people. But I want to kind of fast forward. I met Dave. We're celebrating our 5th year anniversary this month, which I'm super excited. He was a extraordinary fighter pilot, and I didn't realize it until we went to a recent event where one of the guys off of his squadron, his wife died of cancer. And so we're always surrounded by cancer, right? One way or another. And we were celebrating Marcel's life. And when my husband's original squadron saw him, 3 of them started crying. And these were grown men, of what an extraordinary leader Dave was. And if you've not met him or talked to him, he's just a simple guy from Kentucky that grew up on a farm. And I could not have been more blessed. He's probably one of the most amazing Christians that I've ever met. He will recite verse after verse after verse. And he'll say, you really need to read this psalm today. And he's just extraordinary. And I was blessed with, he has 2 boys. One is a fighter pilot now, and the other one was flying AWACS. Now he's a trainer for young pilots. And they all embrace Taylor, and it's just been fantastic. So I am absolutely blessed. It came to, an odd thing where I just went to Fort Eustis. I want to be conscious of your time here. I went to Fort Eustis just for a regular checkup. And that's when I got a phone call the next day from a surgeon down at the medical center, Portsmouth Navy Hospital, which is an unbelievable experience. Thank God for TRICARE and great insurance. Thank you for my husband for that and his 26 years of service. But the surgeon said, we need you to come down. And he walked me through the whole thing. My husband happened to be out of town. And he said, you have, stage 3 cancer and blah, blah, but we really think we can go in. And it was a neat experience, very much like Taylor's UCSF NICU unit, where you had educational teams come around. It was an educational hospital. And so the same thing with the Portsmouth, I had the lead cancer surgeon, and he had his entire team coming around doing rounds with him. And I could not have been any luckier. But it was interesting because I don't know if we were fairly new to Abington. I think we'd been there for at least 3 years. And Sven got up at 4:30 in the morning. And I had told him that I was having surgery, but I'm, like everything else, I get through it. I just want to make sure Taylor was figured out with his aid. I brought my mom into town and everybody was taken care of in the house. And 4:30 in the morning, Sven gets up. He shows up about 4:45. And I was so surprised because I had no idea. And they were about to put me on the gurney to go into the surgery. And I was so surprised that this man is standing there like, oh my gosh, we just talked about this. Like, don't worry about it. You don't have to get up so early in the morning to come down and do this. And thank God he did, because he anointed me. And I remember I'll never forget this moment. And it changed a lot of what you talk about as spiritual moments. I was laying on that gurney and this gentleman was wheeling me away. And for the first time in my life, I felt complete peace. And if I left and it didn't work out in surgery or whatever, you always have those thoughts in your mind. I knew I was going to be okay. And that is an extraordinary experience of that Christ moment where everything just stopped and time stopped. And it was almost like I didn't hear anything. Everything went quiet and it was okay. And I figured, this is where you're supposed to be in life. And I pray I have that feeling when it is time for me to go, because if I can feel that peace, I'm okay. And I want everybody else to know that I'm okay and I live the best life I ever possibly could. And I don't plan on going anywhere for at least 30, 40 more years, and mostly for my child. But that's probably the tough part, is I want to make sure that everything is okay for Taylor and then he's taken care of. And then I have done one of those long-term plans. Did you want to say something, Terry?
I mean, you've had an incredible life and you're still a young woman. And I'm so glad to hear what an adventurer you are. I had no idea that you're in motorcycles and yachting and zipping across the country and across continents. But my question is, when did you always feel like you had a spiritual connection from the beginning?
Yes.
Did you have any kind of something to hang on to as you went?
It was always one of those as a little girl. I had, like, Dave always makes fun of me, makes fun of me, but he laughs, that I know my Lord's Prayer. And I was very basic, and we always went to church, but my brother and I were always looking for excuses of not to go to church when we were little. And I never really had that solid connection from my parents. My mother always spoke of God. You believed in God, but it was a whole different level when I met Dave, and really understanding Christ and being that person to be out there. Sven talks about it all the time in his sermons, where you have to keep walking out there and being a messenger in whatever way, spread the word. And that goes back to the article of people not going to church anymore. And I refuse that. I refuse to think that is our reality anymore. I think we need to take it upon ourselves and be that change and bring us back to where we always were as Christians in this country. I do remember, and I wrote about it in the book, I just couldn't find the page again, where I used to, when I was still in that horrible marriage, I used to lock myself in the master bathroom, and I would take a hot bath. And this was when I was 8-9 months pregnant with Taylor. And I would put my ears underwater because it silences everything out. And that's all you hear is that. It was very soothing. And I figured it was very soothing to Taylor. And I remember doing a full scan of Taylor's body when he was in my belly. And it was one of those very spiritual moments where something was definitely, I went from the fingers to the toes to his belly, like every part of his body, and everything was fine until I got to his head, and something was different. And I knew that something was not right. And I remember rubbing my belly and saying, baby, it's okay. Whatever it is, we're going to figure it out. And that same moment happened again when he was placed on my chest. And, everything became bustling, but at the same time, it was very quiet when he was born. And I felt like that was another very serious spiritual moment where I had a connection that I've never had before. And we all talk about that with our kids, especially as mothers and women when they're first born. But it was one of those that it kept spiraling. And what was interesting about Taylor and his birth, and I kind of like a rebirth of me and my spiritual awareness, was no matter where Taylor and I have been, when we did the drive across country, somebody would say, oh, I have a 10-year-old. And that was their, conversation of whatever disability their child was, or, oh, my grandchild is now 15 years old. But it was this journey across the United States, and wherever Taylor and I have been, we've always had that spiritual connection, and others kind of keep coming to us, if that makes sense at all. And that's why I became such a big advocate for really kids with all disabilities and for parents, as well as teachers. And that was kind of the end of the book. You all have known that I really wanted to start a project, and it is a daunting task, and the more I got into it, the more I realized how difficult it was. So my health has to come number one, but I had started this project, as most of you know, Abington Academy, and it was literally building a farm to table, fully sustainable vocational tech program where you could also have OT, PT speech for our kids that need it. And the kids that are not on track to go to college, this is an unbelievable experience for them, that they could learn all the different trades, which we're losing. We're losing plumbers, we're losing contractors, we're losing finished carpenters, we're losing electricians. But the whole point of this is to envelope it, Abington Academy is what I've called it, to envelope this into what does our future of Abington Church look like? What does our spiritual moment in life going forward, what does that look like? And I feel really strongly that we can't lose that bond that we all have with Abington Church or with any of our churches. I think we really need to take that seriously and realize that, there are always a lot of people out there, wolves in sheep's clothing. And I experienced it many times throughout my life. But that can't be it, right? There is always a new beginning and a new spiritual awakening and a new spirit that has to keep morphing into our next generations to come. And that was my whole point with Abington Academy, was to keep us going as a community. And when I met with Gloucester Building Department, anybody that I met with, teachers, aides, everybody that I told this project, all they could say was, how can we help you? How can we get this going? And I felt like, oh my gosh, we can't let this go. And I have put it on hold temporarily. I think we're on the upswing of this past 2 years, but I didn't want to start a $30 or $40 million project, whatever it is. Those are kind of in numbers until we knew that we were going into a safe position.
Does anyone in the group have any questions that they'd like to ask Kimberly at this point? Natalie?
I don't have a question, Kim. I have a comment that when you were talking about when you were living in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania, you were about an hour and a half outside of New York City.
Mm-hmm.
And so part of my life was growing up on Eastern Long Island. And when you said my mother would take us into the city, it's like everybody knows there's only one city,
yep.
and it's New York.
Yep.
It's just like you'd say the city, didn't even have to explain it. New York.
Yep. I know, because they never said that when I lived in San Francisco. They never said that.
Right. And when I was in Chicago, we wouldn't say that. But in New York, we're going to the city. It's
yep.
New York. I mean, that's the only city there is. It's not Paris. There's not New Orleans. There's not Chicago. There's New York. Period.
It's a special place. Yeah, I agree. So I'm sorry if that wasn't as concise as I normally am. Like I said, I'm just a little under the weather.
Yeah, but she's just a little under the weather with 102-degree temperature. So I think it's amazing she's sitting upright. Peggy, I saw you raise your hand.
Yeah, I'm from Pennsylvania, in a very small town in Pennsylvania. There were 29 people in my high school graduating class, so it was very small. Wow. So I was wondering what town in Pennsylvania you were from.
I was born in Quakertown, and then my dad lives still in Saucon Valley, and then I grew up mostly in Bucks County. I mean, like I said, I moved 26 times before I was a senior in high school.
So that's kind of the Philadelphia area, pretty much? Yep. Yeah, I was from Northeast Scranton, the Northeast. Okay. So, and we were an hour from New York, Binghamton, New York. But again, my mother and I, we used to go to, Natalie, the city. We would go to the city. It was about an hour and a half away, and that's what we would do, go to Radio City Music Hall and stuff like that. But we would take the bus. But okay, thank you.
Kimberly, now that Taylor is 17?
Mm-hmm.
What are you currently doing to assist him?
He has a one-to-one aide. So Laura's full-time, and she's been great. She actually has a 4-year-old with autism, bless her heart. And she has 2 other kids about Taylor's age. So he has a full other family now over there. He loves doing sleepovers, and that's been amazing. He is in a self-contained, which I'm not thrilled about, high school, Lafayette High School here in Williamsburg. And it's actually going really well. He's doing well. I did fight. He was given a one-to-one aid for his communication and lack thereof with his device and him being nonverbal. That always has been a struggle. I'm not sure why insurance companies don't consider deaf or nonverbal a priority, which is really strange. So I have gotten him into that one-to-one program. And then, and he probably has, I think they have 6 kids in the classroom. He goes to horseback riding on Thursdays. He meets with his BCBA here at the house. That's a behaviorist for 3 hours every Wednesday. And then on Tuesdays after school, he has a speech therapist for 45 minutes. And other than that, I really looked into different programs. He was working, there was an 8-week program where he went to Food Lion, stocking shelves and rearranging things and cleaning and whatever. And just a big fighter to say, don't ever settle for what somebody tells your kid is able to do. My dad kind of joked a few years ago and said, why don't you just leave him alone? Why don't you just let him be? And I said, isn't that sad if that's how we look at all our kids? Oh, just let him be. And I'm like, no, Taylor can do this. And then, we took him to his first symphony last week. I figured it out that he was a huge, huge classical music fan. And I always knew this in church ever since he was a little baby. I was always the one that sat in the back of the church because I never knew if he was going to cry or have a fit or whatever. And ever since he was a baby, he just loved that music and he loved the peace of church. And that was another outlet, Terry, of when he was literally, I think he was about 8 weeks old. And that's when I first started going to church with him. And it was just he and I. But kind of fast forward, he has picked up the violin, where I gave him a violin for his 16th birthday, and he put it up just like he'd been playing for the past 5 years. It was the weirdest thing. He's just amazing. And I think that's the other sad part when I talk about labels with people is, if you really want to treat everybody the same, we're all on the same playing field, let go of the labels. Let go of, oh, he has Down syndrome, or he has autism, or she has cerebral palsy. It doesn't really, or I'm dyslexic. It doesn't really matter at the end of the day. Mm-hmm. We'll see what happens. You know, it's definitely not easy for Dave. I've never known any other life having a child than with Taylor. It's tough on Dave, you know, and he has 2 very, very bright kids. He has a different relationship with Taylor. I wish it was closer, but I think that's just life. You know, nothing is ever going to be perfect, and you can check off all the boxes, but you make it work if you really care about each other. And we all love each other very much. It is definitely tough for men with kids with disabilities.
Well, I think one of the personal story of you folks coming to Abingdon is that you sit in the back pew, and Taylor brings his little cars and plays with them. And when we would do the sign of the peace, he would always kind of duck his head and didn't want to be a part. And I guess there was something about that made my husband Tom go, he's not going to ignore me. And so every time Tom would go back, well, the day that Taylor looked up and fist bumped him, I think Tom cried through the rest of the service. He goes, Taylor recognized me today. He was just so thrilled. Yeah.
And it's those little, there was a place called Brookwood Community, and it really is, if you guys have an opportunity to get online, Brookwood Community is for people, older adults, living, working down in Houston, Texas. And somebody there wrote a book called God Winks, and that's what those moments are. They're little God winks. We joke that all it is a fist bump, and all of a sudden you've broken a barrier. Yeah. And I think we can learn from kids like Taylor that are so smart, that are underappreciated because they might be nonverbal, they might not, you know, to participate the way we think that he should. And then all of a sudden you have that moment where you have that fist bump, where he picks up a violin, and you're like, oh my gosh, who are you in there?
Exactly.
You're really extraordinary. And why have you been holding out on me? So
I don't know I'm sorry. Go ahead, Peggy. You're muted.
Yeah, okay. I'm a retired speech therapist. So you said that Taylor is nonverbal and has a device. Yes. And does he do sign language? Is that?
A little bit. I think with the Downs, he was always very kind of floppy and just didn't have the hand.
The coordination.
Memory. Yeah. That was always, so we do simple signs, but now we're really working hard, not just using that device, but really pushing that out. He has speech apraxia.
Okay.
And so he's just not, I always explain it to people that he's just not making that synapse connection. But when he does, it's unbelievable. So it first started off at and now it's mom. And so
that's great. Yes, that's wonderful.
I mean, it's there. You take what you can get. But yeah, he's been all over the country. I took him he wasn't walking, so I found out about a program called Dan Marino Children's Hospital in Miami, Florida. So I took him and I had him in his little Robbie shoes, and he's on the treadmill. It was the little kid's treadmill and a harness. And sure enough, I said, by 2 years old, you are going to walk. By 2 years old, he was walking. Huh. Now he's 17, and I'm like, all right, guess what, buddy? You're going to work, you're going to start cleaning the house, and you're going to start emptying the dishwasher. Because we're not doing our kids any favors by babying them.
Yeah.
You got to push whoever it is, just keep pushing them. And I won't settle, because I think he has extraordinary potential. It just depends how much leeway you want to leave for that.
Well, sounds like he has a great mom. So
thanks.
Natalie?
So, Kimma, maybe a sobering question. I don't know. So you're 52. Uh-huh. Is that what you said? And Taylor is 17. Mm-hmm. So you're looking at wishfully another 40, when I say wishful hope, another 40 years, put you at about 92.
Yeah.
If you're like my mother, she gets around and everything. She's 91, but and Taylor would be 57.
Right.
Kind of do math in my head. What's your greatest fear?
There's the violin.
Okay.
What is my greatest fear?
As a parent, that future as a parent. Yeah.
Katie.
Hello, Taylor.
There's the violin.
Yes.
Okay, bud. Everybody asks this, and it's kind of one of those, because he's about to be 18. I want him to be as independent as possible. If he wants to live in a residential community living, I'm all for it. But I'm also a mom that wants to protect him too much too. So it'll be interesting what ends up happening. They do have a really good program. It's a 9-week program outside Charlottesville, and it teaches independence skills. It's similar to the project that I'm working on for Abington Academy, but it's a little bit different in that it's more job skills training. And it's a short program. Whereas Abington Academy sees kids through from 14 to in their 30s or 40s. Okay.
Is he ready for the meeting to be over?
He's fine. He's been really good considering everything this morning. He's good.
Oh, that's cool.
He's just telling us, "Hey, I'm here. You were talking about my violin, so here it
is."
is."
Yeah, right.
So that's what I'm hoping, Natalie, is that he can be as independent as possible. But it's hard to say what that is. I mean, you cannot leave him alone.
Yeah, so, Winona's here. I guess you can, because Winona and I both. Winona still does emergency services. We both work for outpatient mental health in the area. Right. And we do, I did, and she still does, we do emergency service. Really, we should say crisis intervention. Right. But anyway, so we would see people, particularly elderly parents. Mm-hmm. I have children with disabilities, if you will, or even young parents, I guess. And it was always a struggle about what was going to happen when the parents got older, or the parents weren't able to do for their children. So trying to encourage them to do what you're doing is to give those people, the children, some independence, teach them some independent skills.
Absolutely.
Because you're not going to be here forever.
No.
That's that's just that's the long and short of it. I guess none of us is going to be here forever. So when we're not around, and I think really almost, and this isn't Taylor's case, but if you talk about disability, substance use disorders is a disability. Mm-hmm. And when you have adults with substance use disorders whose parents, mostly mothers, who are still coddling them and not encouraging them to be independent. It's the same kind of thing. I worked at a rehab, not a rehab. It wasn't even halfway. It was a dry tank sort of thing. Anyway, and it was a 3-day non-medical detox center. And the number of mostly men who came in there overnight, followed by their mostly elderly mothers, begging us to take care of their, frankly, intoxicated sons. And we were like, you're 80, he's 50.
Yep. Tough love.
He's going to outlive you. So it's just a struggle for parents.
Yeah, it's tough. And I think the biggest thing is I just recently did my will, put things into a trust, and we're by no means wealthy. We're very moderate. So what I was trying to do was make sure everything was mapped out. So if anything happens to me, everything goes into a trust. We did, they came out with something else recently called the ABLE account for people with disabilities. And you can have, I forget what the amount is now. You can have a certain amount of money in that account if you have a diagnosed disability, and the government can't come after that. And so before the ABLE account, you couldn't have anything above $1,300 in your savings account if you're somebody like Taylor.
That's right.
And so,
that's right.
Yeah, so Winona, we did this Able account, and I just put a little tiny bit of money in it every single month, and hopefully, it'll stack into something. And if Taylor has an inheritance or anything, that goes into that Able account. And at least it assures me that I have a clear path. I did designate, a full-time family for Taylor to go to. I don't think Dave is equipped, and he and I are both very realistic. Taylor's a special kid, and it definitely takes a special person. But the one thing I want to say to that, Natalie, is I remember running into a family. Taylor was just a mess. When he was little, he ran everywhere. You couldn't control him. And there was this older family, and I bet their daughter was at least 30 years old. And the mom looked at me, and she noticed that Taylor was, I think, 6 or 7 at the time, and he still wasn't potty trained. And I said, I can't, we've been doing this for a couple of years now, and he's just not catching on. I finally spent 16 days in the bathroom with Taylor, charting his, when he goes number 1, when he goes number 2. The only time we would go downstairs or go anywhere was to, this is when he was 9 years old, was when when we needed to go to the grocery store, obviously when we needed to eat. But for 16 days, I held on until that kid was potty trained. And that was the one thing that the mother looked at me with this 30-year-old, and she said, you need to figure this out. He needs to be as independent as possible. And so this is somebody that was probably, in her 60s saying, you really need to start working on this now, because it's not going to get easier. And I think that was one of my misnomers when I have parents come up to me. This is their journey. I can't fix, their situation with their child. I can give them tools to move forward, but I had to stop trying to take care of everybody, because I have to take care of him and myself. It's obviously taken a toll on me. And so anybody, I don't care what child it is and what, however old they are, they need to be as independent as possible, period.
Yeah. Kimberly, can you hear me?
Yep.
This is Winona. I was muted for a while. I'm sorry I'm not able to be more fully present, but I just wanted to tell you thank you, that I'm really, really grateful to you that you're willing to bravely tell your story, all of it, as much as you told, with grace and as much dignity as you can muster. Thank you.
Thank you.
We don't do a good job in our world taking care of people who need a little bit of extra help. And, the whole point in my mind of Breath of Fresh Air is how can we be better connected, touching each other's lives and embracing our spirituality, not just our perceptions of how we think we are and what we have and what we don't have, but of who we really are. And I just wanted to tell you, thank you.
Thank you. And what I would say to that, Terry, is everybody needs to go back to church.
Yes.
We wouldn't have the problems we are now if everybody would just go back to church. We wouldn't have.
It would be helpful. Does anyone else have anything they would like to say to Kimberly?
One more thing. So Kimberly, it was interesting because Winona and Terry and I, not just because of this, but we're all on the vestry. And one of the things we're doing this weekend, we're sending out handwritten notes to our vestry contacts. And so, in my little template, which I struggled to get down to 3 to 5 sentences, which is not, it's like 10. But anyway, what I identify is as one of the things I'm grateful for being at Abington is Sven's dedication to holding us together.
Yep.
We sat outside at 7 o'clock in the morning with him in the rain and the cold weather under the tent. We mustered some folks who are tech savvy to get us online. And, I don't know if we're all there, but when I go to the 8 o'clock service, I see the people. So now that we're back in even when we were in the yard outside in our cars, but now that we're back inside, I pretty much see the same people who I saw there pre-COVID. So I can't speak to the 10 o'clockers, but he endeavored to keep us together. So I think Abington's back, well, as much as we can be right now.
I agree.
Kimberly, thank you so much for bearing through your illness. And if I were you and you could do it, take your aspirin and go turn off the lights. But I know mom days don't get to go that way.
No, they don't. But thank you.
It's an incredible story. Fighting for Taylor. I hope you do a sequel or add on so that people will walk away with even more hope that when they're faced with such challenges, there is a way through. And you're an amazing woman. And through the cancer and all the other challenges you've been given, you're still so kind and so open and so willing to help. And the fact that you're working on this Abingdon Academy, I'm praying with everything I have that is going to come to fruition, because I just think many of us are probably educators. It's something that is greatly lacking in our country. And if you want, I'm with all these families this weekend and everybody's getting a bathroom redone or a shed built. And they're like, I can't get anybody to do the work. And I'm like, I know, because we educate 20% of our people to go to college and the other 80% go educate themselves to do something.
Exactly.
So we have a lot of work to do, and you're doing it one step at a time.
Thank you.
Thank you for today. I want to remind everybody that on December the 11th, Tom Coy is going to be with us. He was with us as part of the meeting today. He's going to share his 2019 pilgrimage on the Camino de Santiago. And he said, you say Santiago, Camino de Santiago, and he said, and I'm all over it. So he's going to have a slide presentation of his trip and the impact that it's had on his life since he's come back. And if you all are ready, Winona, did you want to do the closing prayer, or would you like me to do it?
I would prefer that you do, Terry.
Okay. I'm going to do what the Episcopalians love to do, go to the Book of Common Prayer, which has a prayer for everything, and close us out with that. Peace be with you.
And also with you.
The prayer today is for the care. Today is for the care of children. Almighty God, Heavenly Father, you have blessed us with the joy and care of children. Give us calm strength and patient wisdom as we bring them up, that we may teach them to love whatever is just and true and good, following the example of our Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen.